Chapter 10, The Personal Intelligences. In 1909, G. Stanley Hall, the psychologist president of Clark University, invited Sigmund Freud and a few of his colleagues to the United States to deliver some introductory lectures on the recently devised theory of psychoanalysis. It was the first, and as it turned out, the only time that Freud traveled to America, and interest in his new theory and method of treatment was keen. Freud presented a masterful set of lectures on the origins and development of psychoanalysis, a series that introduced his then controversial theory of the human personality, and helped to further the cause of psychoanalysis in the United States. Though it left the mainstream psychological establishment, which was about to take a radical behaviorist turn, completely unmoved, with one exception. From Cambridge, Massachusetts, William James, Dean of American Psychologists and Philosophers, already elderly and ill, made the day-long journey to Worcester to hear Freud and to meet the younger scholar from Austria. After the lecture, James went up to Freud and said simply, "The future of psychology belongs to your work." Historian of social science H. Stuart Hughes has commented, "There is no more dramatic moment in the intellectual history of our time. Freud and James represented different historical movements, different philosophical traditions, different programs for psychology. Freud, the pessimistic European intellectual, had chosen to focus on the development of the individual psyche, its battles within the individual's immediate family, the struggle for independence, and the manifold anxieties and defenses that attend the human condition. For Freud, the key to health was self-knowledge and a willingness to confront the inevitable pains and paradoxes of human existence." James had considerable sympathy with this analysis, for his own life had featured many of the strains and tensions that Freud graphically described. Yet James also sensed a difference in the emphasis in their respective worldviews. While praising Freud, he had also pointed out to a confidant, "I hope that Freud and his pupils will push their ideas to the utmost limits so that we can learn what they are." It reveals an entirely unsuspected peculiarity in the constitution of human nature. James, in fact, had chosen to embrace a more positively oriented form of psychology, one less circumscribed by the biological imperatives of behavior, more open to the possibilities of change and growth. More so than his Austrian counterpart, the American thinker stressed the importance of relationships with other individuals as a means of gaining ends, of effecting progress, and of knowing oneself. In a famous phrase, he had commented, "A man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him and carry an image around of him in their mind." Perhaps most important, James was a potent influence on the succeeding generation of social scientists, including James Mark Baldwin and George Herbert Mead, who came to focus on the social origins of knowledge and on the interpersonal nature of an individual's sense of self. But what united Freud and James, and what set them apart from the mainstream of psychology both on the continent and in the United States, was a belief in the importance, the centrality of the individual self, a conviction that psychology must be built around the concept of the person, his personality, his growth, his fate. Moreover, both scholars deemed the capacity for self-growth to be an important one, upon which depended the possibility of coping with one's surroundings. While neither would have used the phrase, I find it reasonable to say that both of these redoubtable psychologists were sympathetic to the idea of personal intelligences. At the same time, however, their orientations towards such intelligences would have differed. Freud was interested in the self as located in the individual and, as a clinician, was preoccupied with an individual's own knowledge of himself. Given this bias, a person's interest in other individuals was justified chiefly as a better means of gaining further understanding of one's own problems, wishes, and anxieties, and ultimately of achieving one's goals. In contrast, James's interest, and even more so, the interests of the American social psychologists who succeeded him, fell much more on the individual's relationship to the outside community. Not only did one's knowledge of self come largely from an ever-increasing appreciation of how others thought about the individual, but the purpose of self-knowledge was less to promote one's personal agenda and more to ensure the smooth functioning of the wider community. In this chapter, I shall examine the development of both of these aspects of human nature. On the one side, there is the development of the internal aspects of a person. The core capacity at work here is access to one's own feeling life, one's range of affects or emotions, the capacity instantly to affect discriminations among these feelings and eventually to label them, to enmesh them in symbolic codes, to draw upon them as a means of understanding and guiding one's behavior. In its most primitive form, the intrapersonal intelligence amounts to little more than the capacity to distinguish a feeling of pleasure from one of pain, and on the basis of such discrimination, to become more involved in or to withdraw from a situation. At its most advanced level, intrapersonal knowledge allows one to detect and to symbolize complex and highly differentiated sets of feelings. One finds this form of intelligence developed in the novelist, like Proust, who can write introspectively about feelings in the patient, or the therapist, who comes to attain a deep knowledge of his own feeling life, and in the wise elder who draws upon his own wealth of inner experiences in order to advise members of his community. The other personal intelligence turns outward to other individuals. The core capacity here is the ability to notice and make distinctions among other individuals, and in particular among their moods, temperaments, motivations, and intentions. Examined in its most elementary form, the interpersonal intelligence entails the capacity of the young child to discriminate among the individuals around him and to detect their various moods. In an advanced form, interpersonal knowledge permits a skilled adult to read the intentions and desires, even when these have been hidden, of many other individuals and, potentially, to act upon this knowledge. For example, by influencing a group of disparate individuals to behave along desired lines. We see highly developed forms of interpersonal intelligence in political and religious leaders, a Mahatma Gandhi or a Lyndon Johnson, in skilled parents and teachers, and in individuals enrolled in the helping professions, be they therapists, counselors, or shamans. More so than in other realms, one encounters a tremendous variety of forms of interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence. Indeed, just because each culture has its own symbol systems, its own means for interpreting experiences, the raw materials of the personal intelligences quickly get marshaled by systems of meaning that may be quite distinct from one another. Accordingly, while the forms of spatial or bodily kinesthetic intelligence are readily identified and compared across diverse cultures, the varieties of personal intelligence prove much more distinctive, less comparable, perhaps even unknowable to someone from an alien society. Even as the symbolization and enculturation of personal intelligences takes many forms, there are also numerous varieties of breakdowns and pathologies. Indeed, breakdown of the personal intelligences necessarily takes different forms, depending on the normal blend within each culture. What might be pathological in one setting can be deemed normal in another. Moreover, rather than simply declining in acuity, an intelligence often assumes aberrant and pathological forms, as inappropriate distinctions are made and acted upon. In one sense, this is analogous to what happens in the language domain, when individuals suffer from different aphasias. Yet, for the analogy to be completely valid, the forms of aphasia would have to differ strikingly across cultures. In view of such distinctions between personal and other forms of intelligence, a question may appropriately be raised. Are the intrapersonal and interpersonal forms of knowing comparable to those faculties of musical, linguistic, or spatial intelligence that have been reviewed in earlier chapters, or has some classificatory error been committed? In tackling this question, it is important not to gloss over differences between the personal and other forms of intelligence. We have already indicated some. The natural course of the personal intelligences is more attenuated than that of other forms, inasmuch as the particular symbolic and interpretive systems of each culture soon come to impose a decisive coloring on these latter forms of information processing. Also, as I have noted, the patterns of development and of breakdown in the personal intelligences turn out to be far more varied than in other intelligences. And there is an especially wide range of end states. I have also intimated another difference. Whereas each of our other intelligences has been comfortably discussed independently of the others, I have here linked two forms of intelligence. To be sure, each form has its own pull, with the intrapersonal intelligence involved chiefly in an individual's examination and knowledge of his own feelings, while the interpersonal intelligence looks outward toward the behavior, feelings, and motivations of others. Moreover, as we shall see, each form has its characteristic neurological representation and pattern of breakdown. The reason, then, for treating these together is chiefly expositional. In the course of development, these two forms of knowledge are intimately intermingled in any culture, with knowledge of one's own person perennially dependent upon the ability to apply lessons learned from the observation of other people, while knowledge of others draws upon the internal discriminations the individual routinely makes. Our two forms of personal intelligence could, in fact, be described separately, but to do so would involve unnecessary duplication as well as artificial separation. Under ordinary circumstances, neither form of intelligence can develop without the other. Other differences surrounding the personal intelligences should be mentioned. For one thing, the sanctions surrounding pathologies in these areas tend to be far stronger than those that greet disorders of the other intelligences. For another, the premium for acting upon one's particular personal intelligence is far greater. While the decision to employ or not to employ one's musical or spatial intelligence is not heavily charged, the pressures to employ one's personal intelligences are acute. It is the unusual individual who does not try to deploy his understanding of the personal realm in order to improve his own well-being or his relationship to the community. There is, of course, no guarantee that his form of personal intelligence will prove adequate to this task, or that he will be able to achieve what he wants. Forms of personal intelligences, no less than forms of other intelligences, can misfire or fail in their intent, and know that does not readily or reliably translate into know-how. Given such differences, why have I incorporated personal intelligences in my survey? Chiefly because I feel that these forms of knowledge are of tremendous importance in many, if not all, societies in the world. Forms that have, however, tended to be ignored or minimized by nearly all students of cognition. It is not relevant to my inquiry to explore the reasons for this omission. But whatever the reasons, this omission has spawned a view of intellect that is all too partial, and makes it difficult to understand the goals of many cultures and the ways in which these goals are achieved. Moreover, according to our original list of criteria, the personal intelligences pass muster rather well. As I have already intimated, there is an identifiable core to each, a characteristic pattern of development, and a number of specifiable end states, as well as impressive evidence for neurological representation and for discernible patterns of breakdown. Evolutionary evidence is beginning to come forth, and there is good reason to anticipate that we will eventually understand a great deal about the phylogenetic origins of these intelligences. Evidence for exceptional individuals, prodigies or freaks in the personal realms, is less persuasive but by no means lacking. There is less of relevance in the realms of experimental psychology and psychological testing than would be desirable, but this lack is more likely due to the reluctance of hard-nosed psychologists to investigate this area than it is due to insuperable difficulties in assessing these forms of knowledge. Last, while one does not ordinarily think of forms of personal knowledge as being encoded in public symbol systems, I deem symbolization to be of the essence in the personal intelligences. Without a symbolic code supplied by the culture, the individual is confronted with only his most elementary and unorganized discrimination of feelings. But armed with such a scheme of interpretation, he has the potential to make sense of the full range of experiences that he and others in his community can undergo. In addition, it seems legitimate to construe rituals, religious codes, and mythic and totemic systems as symbolic codes that capture and convey crucial aspects of personal intelligence. As we shall see, an emerging sense of self proves to be a key element in the realm of the personal intelligences, one of overriding importance to individuals the world over. While a developed sense of self is ordinarily viewed as a quintessential manifestation of intrapersonal intelligence, my own inquiry has led to a different conclusion. The wide variety of selves encountered throughout the world suggests that this sense is better thought of as an amalgam, one that emerges from a combination or fusion of one's intrapersonal and one's interpersonal knowledge. The overwhelming differences in senses of self around the world reflect the fact that the merger can come about in widely divergent ways, depending on those aspects of the person and of persons that happen to be accentuated in different cultures. Accordingly, in what follows, I shall use the term sense of self to refer to the balance struck by every individual and every culture between the promptings of inner feelings and the pressures of other persons. Allusion to sense of self suggests a reason that researchers may have hesitated to construe the personal intelligences in cognitive form. A developed sense of self often appears as the highest achievement of human beings, a crowning capacity that supersedes and presides over other more mundane and partial forms of intelligence. It is also that capacity about which individuals have the strongest and most intimate views. Thus, it becomes a sensitive as well as an elusive target to examine. Difficulty of study and a high degree of personal involvement are not, of course, valid reasons to avert the scrutiny of scientific investigation. And it is my hope that, through the kinds of investigation launched in this chapter, one can see that the sense of self, while marvelous, is not immune from study. Instead, it can be traced to two forms of intelligence that every human being has the opportunity to develop and to merge. In the last analysis, the personal intelligences amount to information processing capacities, one directed inward, the other outward, that are available to every human infant as part of its species' birthright. This fact of life dictates an examination of personal intelligences. The capacity to know oneself and to know others is as inalienable a part of the human condition as is the capacity to know objects or sounds, and it deserves to be investigated no less than these other, less charged forms. Personal intelligences may not prove completely cognate with the forms of intelligence we have already encountered. But, as I pointed out at the start of this inquiry, there is no reason to expect that any pair of intelligences will be completely comparable. What is important is that they should be part of the human intellectual repertoire, and that their origins should take roughly comparable form the world over. Various forms of personal intelligence clearly arise in the first instance from the bond between the infant and its caretaker. In almost all cases, the infant and its mother. Evolutionary and cultural history have combined to make this attachment link an indispensable component of normal growth. During the first year of life, the child comes to form a potent tie to the mother, aided by the equally strong attraction that the mother feels toward her offspring. And it is in these strong ties and the feelings that accompany them that the origins of personal knowledge can be found. For a year or so, the tie is at maximum strength, so that the child becomes disturbed when he is suddenly separated from his mother, or when a strange adult is seen as threatening the bond. The child seeks to maintain the positive feeling of well-being and to avoid situations of pain or anxiety. Then gradually the link becomes looser and more flexible as the child ventures forth from home base, now secure in the knowledge that he can return to find the mother there, and thereby regain feelings of belonging. If for some reason the bond is not permitted to form properly, or if it is broken abruptly and not soon repaired, profound difficulties are signaled for the child. We know both from Harry Harlow's work with motherless monkeys and from John Bowlby's studies of institutionalized infants that the lack of an attachment bond can wreak devastating effects on normal development in the present and in succeeding generations. Especially important for our purposes, the absence of such a bond signals difficulty for an individual's eventual ability to know other persons, to rear offspring, and to draw upon this knowledge as he comes to know himself. Thus, the initial tie between infant and caretaker may be looked on as nature's effort to ensure that the personal intelligences are properly launched. One can divide the growth of personal knowledge into a number of steps or stages. At each step, it is possible to identify certain features that are important for the development of intrapersonal intelligence, as well as other factors that prove crucial for the growth of interpersonal intelligence. The portrait to be given here necessarily focuses on the development of personal intelligences within the context of our own society, for it is chiefly this trajectory that has so far been studied. Only later will I be able to touch on some of the features that may characterize personal intelligences in other cultures. The infant. Though there is no way to place oneself within the infant's skin, it seems likely that from the earliest days of life, all normal infants experience a range of feelings, a gamut of affects, observation of infants within and across cultures, and comparison of their facial expressions with those of other primates confirm that there is a set of universal facial expressions displayed by all normal children. The most reasonable inference is that there are bodily and brain states associated with these expressions, with infants experiencing phenomenally a range of states of excitement and of pleasure or pain. To be sure, these states are initially uninterpreted. The infant has no way of labeling to himself how he is feeling or why he is feeling this way. But the range of bodily states experienced by the infant, the fact that he feels, that he may feel differently on different occasions, and that he can come to correlate feelings with specific experiences, serves to introduce the child to the realm of intrapersonal knowledge. Moreover, these discriminations also constitute the necessary point of departure for the eventual discovery that he is a distinct entity with his own experiences and his unique identity. Even as the infant is coming to know his own bodily reactions and to differentiate them one from another, he is also coming to form preliminary distinctions among other individuals and even among the moods displayed by familiar others. By 2 months of age, and perhaps even at birth, the child is already able to discriminate among and imitate the facial expressions of other individuals. This capacity suggests a degree of pre-tunedness to the feelings and behavior of other individuals that is extraordinary. The child soon distinguishes mother from father, parents from strangers, happy expressions from sad or angry ones. Indeed, by the age of 10 months, the infant's ability to discriminate among different affective expressions already yields distinctive patterns of brainwaves. In addition, the child comes to associate various feelings with particular individuals, experiences, and circumstances. There are already the first signs of empathy. The young child will respond sympathetically when he hears the cry of another infant or sees someone in pain. Even though the child may not yet appreciate just how the other is feeling, he seems to have a sense that something is not right in the world of the other person. A link among familiarity, caring, and altruism has already begun to form. Thanks to a clever experimental technique devised by Gordon Gallup for studies with primates, we have a way of ascertaining when the human infant first comes to view himself as a separate entity, an incipient person. It is possible, unbeknownst to the child, to place a tiny marker, for example a daub of rouge, upon his nose and then to study his reactions as he peers at himself in the mirror. During the first year of life, the infant is amused by the rouge marking, but apparently simply regards it as an interesting decoration on some other organism that he happens to be examining in the mirror. But during the second year of life, the child comes to react differently when he beholds the alien coloring. Children will touch their own noses and act silly or coy when they encounter this unexpected redness on what they perceive to be their very own anatomy. Awareness of physical separateness and identity are not, of course, the only components of beginning self-knowledge. The child also is starting to react to his own name, to refer to himself by name, to have definite programs and plans that he seeks to carry out, to feel efficacious when he is successful, to experience distress when he violates certain standards that others have set for him, or that he has set for himself. All of these components of the initial sense of person make their initial appearance during the second year of life. The child of age 2 to 5. During the period spanning the ages 2 to 5, the child undergoes a major intellectual revolution as he becomes able to use various symbols to refer to himself, me, my, to other individuals, you, him, mum, you afraid, you sad, and to his own experiences, my birthday, my idea. Words, pictures, gestures, and numbers are among the multifarious vehicles marshaled in service of coming to know the world symbolically, as well as through direct physical actions upon it and sensory discriminations of it. Even in cultures where there are no personal pronouns, the same kinds of symbolic discrimination are readily made. By the conclusion of this period, the child is in fact a symbolizing creature, able to create and extract meanings on the level of symbol use alone. The advent of symbol use has enormous implications for the development of the personal intelligences. The child makes an irrevocable transition from the kinds of simple discrimination of his own moods and those of others that have been possible on an unmediated basis, to a far richer and more elaborated set of discriminations guided by the terminology and the interpretive system of his entire society. No longer must the child rely on pre-programmed discriminations and on his idiosyncratic inferences, if any. Instead, the culture makes available to him an entire system of interpretation, on which he can draw as he attempts to make sense of the experiences he himself undergoes, as well as of those involving others. One way in which this emerging symbolizing ability is turned toward personal development is through the exploration of different roles visible and viable in the community. Through talk, pretend play, gestures, drawing, and the like, the young child tries out facets of the roles of mother and child, doctor and patient, policeman and robber, teacher and pupil, astronaut and Martian. In experimenting with these role fragments, the child comes to know not only which behavior is associated with these individuals, but also something about how it feels to occupy their characteristic niches. At the same time, children come to correlate the behavior and the states of other persons with their own personal experiences. By identifying what is positive or negative, anxiety-provoking or relaxing, powerful or impotent, youngsters effect an important step in defining what they are and what they are not, what they wish to be and what they'd rather avoid. One's sexual identity is an especially important form of self-discrimination that becomes confirmed during this time. In examining major theoretical accounts of this period of life, we can discern the different paths and patterns associated with the two lines of personal intelligence. Following those authorities who focus primarily on the isolated individual, we see the child as a creature apart, one in the course of delineating his own roles and feeling himself different from others. In the Freudian account, for example, the young child is engaged in battles with others, with his parents, his siblings, his other peers, and even the protagonists of fairy tales, all in an effort to establish his own unique presence and powers. In the suggestive language of Erik Erikson, this is a time marked by struggle between feelings of autonomy and shame, and between impulses of initiative and guilt. In Piaget's less affect-laden language, this is a phase of egocentrism, when the child is still locked in his own personal conception of the world. Not yet able fully to put himself into the place of others, he is restricted to his own self-centered views. He may have knowledge of himself, but it is still rigid and frozen. He can state his name and perhaps recount his physical attributes, but he is not yet sensitive to psychological dimensions, to wants or needs, to the possibility of changing roles or expectations. He remains a singularly one-dimensional creature. Troubled or not, the child of this age is described as an individual apart, one striving to establish his autonomy from others, one relatively insensitive to the world of other individuals. An instructively different slant can be found in the American symbolic interactionist school of George Herbert Mead and Charles Cooley, as well as in the Russian mediationist accounts of Lev Vygotsky and Alexander Luria. From the perspective of these observers of childhood, the child can come to know himself during this period only through coming to know other individuals. There is, in fact, no knowledge and no sense of person that can be separated from one's ability to know others, what they are like, and how they view you. Thus, according to this account, the young child is an inherently social creature. As such, he looks to others for their interpretive schemes, and draws upon these schemes as the preferred, indeed the sole, means of discovering and gaining an initial understanding of that person within his own skin. Where an intrapersonal centered view of early childhood begins with an isolated individual who gradually comes to know, and perhaps care, about other persons, the interpersonal view assumes an orientation toward and a gradual knowledge of other individuals as the only available means for eventually discovering the nature of one's own person. While it is conceivable that only one of these views is correct, it appears far more likely that the two approaches are simply stressing different aspects of personal development. The individual-centered approach recognizes that the child at this stage is beset with strong and often conflicting feelings. These impel him to focus on his own condition and stimulate the emerging discovery that he is a separate individual. These dawning insights constitute an important model for that introspecting capacity that lies at the core of intrapersonal knowledge. The socially oriented approach recognizes that the child does not develop in isolation. He is inevitably a member of a community, and his notion of what individuals are like cannot develop in a vacuum. True, he has his own affective experiences, but it is the community that provides an essential point of reference and the necessary interpretive schemes for these affects. Accordingly, knowledge of one's place among others can come only from the external community. The child is inextricably impelled to focus on others, as a clue to himself. Stated most strongly, without a community to provide the relevant categories, individuals, like feral children, would never discover that they are persons. Differentiation between self and others has been pretty well consolidated by the start of school in our society. The child now has attained a first-level social knowledge. He has attained some mastery of a number of different roles adopted by other individuals, as well as an increasingly clear understanding that he is a discrete individual with his own needs, desires, projects, and goals. With the advent of concrete mental operations, the child can also relate in a more flexible manner to other individuals. He has some understanding of reciprocity. He ought to behave toward others in certain ways so that they are likely to return the favor. He sees things in a certain way because of his own perspective, but he has the potential to don the lens of others and to apprehend both material and personal matters from their points of view. To be sure, the suddenness of these insights should not be overdrawn. Clear signs of the decline of egocentrism can be detected during the preschool years, even as other aspects of egocentrism persist throughout life. But it does seem that by the time of entry to school, a clear line between self and other, between one's perspective and that of other individuals, can already be drawn. Even as, or perhaps because, features of one's own person become more fixed, the child now has the option of becoming more of a genuinely social creature. He can step beyond his family circle and forge friendships and peer relations with others. He can appreciate how to treat others in a fair manner. In fact, if anything, he pursues justice to a fault, not yet being able to modulate between the individualizing exigencies of different situations. He also is able to acknowledge the simple intentions and motivations of others, less frequently making the mistake of simply projecting his own wishes onto everyone else. In all, the child at this age comes off as an excessively social and norm-governed creature, as one who wants above all else to be a representative, rather than a specially favored or unfairly mistreated member of the communities in which he lives. During this latency period, as the psychoanalysts have dubbed it, personal feelings, lusts, and anxieties may for a while appear quiescent. But growth of self-interest and self-knowledge is scarcely stilled. Rather, at this time, the child becomes especially concerned with the acquisition of objective skills, knowledge, and competences. In fact, his own definition of self is no longer mired in physical attributes, though it has not yet become focused on psychological features either. For the child of 6, 7, or 8, it is the things he can do and the degree of success with which he can execute them that constitute a chief locus of self-knowledge. This is the age of the acquisition of competence, the building up of industry. The child is colored by a fear of feeling inadequate, of appearing to be an unskilled self. During middle childhood, that 5-year period between the start of school and the beginning of adolescence, there are continuing trends toward greater social sensitivity, toward a keener sense of another's motivations, and toward a fuller sense of one's own competences and lacks. Children become more deeply invested in friendships and will go to considerable lengths to maintain a personal relationship. Loss of treasured chums proves much more painful. A great deal of energy is devoted towards cementing one's place within a friendship network. These groups or cliques may be structured informally, but sometimes, particularly in the case of boys, they will be as formally ordered as a primate dominance hierarchy. Life is heady for those fortunate enough to be included, and correspondingly bleak for those who have lowly places in the group, or are excluded altogether. As children invest much effort into maintaining their friendship patterns, they also devote much time to thinking about the interpersonal realm. With this heightened capacity to place oneself into the skin of specific other individuals, as well as of unfamiliar, generalized others, there is the beginning of intriguing recursive forms of personal knowledge. The child can carry on a set of mental manipulations about possible interactions with other individuals. He thinks that I think that he thinks. No wonder that such pre-adolescents are able to appreciate more subtle forms of literature and to make and appreciate more sophisticated jokes. Risks at this time include premature judgments of inadequacy or unrealistic assessments of efficacy. Children of this age may acquire feelings of learned helplessness as they become convinced that there are certain pursuits that they cannot carry out. For instance, many young girls come to feel that they cannot solve mathematics problems, thus launching a vicious cycle of diminishing expectations and diminishing achievements. The child may also come to feel quite alone if he is unable to forge effective friendships with other individuals. For the first time, this inability to relate to others may be felt as a distinct failing, one that lowers one's image of oneself. Personal feelings are less transient, and if they are genuinely troubling, they may well come to dominate the child's introspections. With the onset of adolescence, personal forms of knowledge take a number of important turns. Moving away somewhat from the frenetic and somewhat unexamined social orientation of earlier years, individuals, at least in our society, become far more psychologically attuned. They prove more sensitive to underlying motivations of other individuals, to their hidden desires and fears. Relationships with others are no longer based primarily on the physical rewards that others may supply, but rather on the psychological support and understanding that a sensitive individual can provide. By the same token, the adolescent seeks friends who value him for his own insights, knowledge, and sensitivity, rather than for his strength or material possessions. Understanding of the social world also becomes much more differentiated. The youth appreciates that any society must have laws in order to function properly, but that these laws should not be blindly obeyed, and that mitigating circumstances should be taken into account. Similarly, justice remains important but cannot be dispensed without taking into account the individualizing factors in a particular dispute or dilemma. Individuals continue to have a desire to be appreciated and loved by others, but there is increasing recognition that total sharing is not possible, and that certain matters must, and perhaps ought to, be kept private. We see then, during the turbulent years of adolescence, a maturation of knowledge of one's own person as well as of knowledge of other persons. But at the same time, within many cultures, an even more crucial event is taking place. Adolescence turns out to be that period of life in which individuals must bring together these two forms of personal knowledge into a larger and more organized sense, a sense of identity, or, to use the term I shall favor hereafter, a sense of self. As formulated by the psychoanalyst Erik Erikson, an emerging identity entails a complex definition of self, of the sort that might have pleased both Freud and James. The individual arrives at a delineation of roles with which he himself is comfortable in terms of his own feelings and aspirations, and at a formulation that makes sense in terms of the community's overall needs and its specific expectations regarding the individual in question. This formation of a sense of self is a project and a process of the utmost importance. The manner of its execution will determine whether the individual can function effectively within the social context in which he has chosen or must choose to live. It is necessary for the individual to come to terms with his own personal feelings, motivations, and desires, including the powerful sexual ones that are his lot for having passed puberty. And so there may well be pressures with which to contend during this stressful period of the life cycle. There may also be considerable pressure and desire to think about one's emerging sense of self. And so propositional knowledge about the self becomes an option, valued in some cultural settings. Perhaps paradoxically, the pressures surrounding the formation of sense of self will be less acute in cultural milieus where the options facing the individual are fewer, where external social expectations prove to be determinant, and the individual's cherished aspirations may well be relegated to marginal status. A number of researchers have attempted to describe the later phases of the maturing self. At times, these accounts have centered on the decisions or the points of tension that must occur in every life. Erikson, for example, speaks of a crisis of intimacy that follows the crisis of identity, as well as of subsequent struggles involved in the issue of generativity in middle age, transmitting values, knowledge, and the possibility of life to the following generation, and in the issue of integrity in old age. Does one's life make sense and cohere? Is one prepared to face death? Some researchers speak of periods of renewed stress in middle age, when it may be too late to change one's life plan, and in old age when one must come to grips with declining powers as well as with growing fears and uncertainties. In contrast, other researchers stress processes of continued development, where an individual has the option of becoming increasingly autonomous, integrated, or self-actualized, provided that he can make the correct moves and arrive at a suitable stance of accepting what cannot be altered. The end goal of these developing processes is a self that is highly developed and fully differentiated from others. Desirable models would include Socrates, Jesus Christ, Mahatma Gandhi, Eleanor Roosevelt, individuals who appear to have understood much about themselves and about their societies, and to have come to terms successfully with the frailties of the human condition, while at the same time inspiring others around them to lead more productive lives. These views of maturity all highlight a relatively autonomous sense of self, one that places a heavy accent on intrapersonal features even when they are marshaled in the service of others. But there is another view that places a far greater emphasis on the formative role of other persons in the sense of self, and consequently, affords little credence to the notion of an autonomous self. According to this point of view, an individual is always and necessarily a set of selves, a group of persons, who perennially reflect the context they happen to inhabit at any particular moment. Rather than a central core self that organizes one's thoughts, behavior, and goals, the person is better thought of as a collection of relatively diverse masks, none of which takes precedence over the others, and each of which is simply called into service as needed and retired when the situation no longer requires it and the scene moves elsewhere. Here, the accent in the sense of self falls much more heavily on interpersonal knowledge and know-how. This point of view, relatively prominent in the disciplines of social psychology and sociology, as against depth psychology, sees as the ultimate determinant of behavior the situation or context in which one is found, and the roles that are accordingly demanded. From this point of view, the ability to manipulate the situation to one's own purposes becomes important. Notions of achieving an integrated personality or of being true to one's deepest values and standards tend to take a back seat. Other perspectives, developed in other cultures, concede that individuals may have the potential to develop in individualistic ways and to evolve an autonomous sense of self, but explicitly reject this line of development as inimical to a sense of community and to the virtue of selflessness. Given prevailing Western ideals, these may seem less attractive or complete views of human nature, but they are not, therefore, by any means proven false or illegitimate. After all, the purpose of social science is not to prove that one's prejudices are well-founded, but rather to come up with that model, or those models, of human behavior that most clearly approximates the actual state of affairs across time and cultural settings. Until this point, I have spoken of the development of personal knowledge as a relatively natural process, in which our ingrained proclivities to make discriminations among our own feelings, or to refine our perceptions of others, are gently prodded along one or another path by the prevailing interpretations of our society. In many cases, in fact, the development of personal knowledge can take place without explicit tutelage. One does not need to show an individual overtly how to make such discriminations. One simply allows them to emerge. But there are cases where far more explicit instruction in the personal realm may appear necessary or advisable. At times, such instruction is at the behest of the society, through formal tutoring or through literature, rituals, and other symbolic forms. The culture helps the growing individual to make discriminations about his own feelings or about the other persons in his milieu. As T.S. Eliot once pointed out, in developing the language, enriching the meaning of words, the poet is making possible a much wider range of emotion and perception for other men because he gives them the speech in which more can be expressed. At other times, the individual himself, desirous of more skills in the personal realm, will seek help in effecting the proper kinds of discrimination. The recourse to therapy in the West may certainly be seen as an effort to train one's ability to make finer and more appropriate discriminations within one's realm of personal feelings, and with respect to reading the signals of other individuals. By the same token, the enduring popularity of self-help books, not excluding that perennial favorite, How to Win Friends and Influence People, represents a widely felt need within an other-directed society for those skills that will enable one to interpret a social situation correctly and then to initiate the proper moves with respect to it. Just how instruction in the personal realm should ideally take place is not known. nor are there reliable measures for determining the extent to which training of personal intelligences has been successful. But it is worth underscoring the point that the education of such emotions and such discriminations clearly involves a cognitive process. To feel a certain way, paranoid, envious, jubilant, is to construe a situation in a certain way, to see something as having a possible effect upon oneself or upon other individuals. One may develop appropriate appraisals, finely honed discriminations, accurate categorizations and classifications of situations. Or less happily, one can make excessively gross discriminations, inappropriate labelings, incorrect inferences, and thus fundamentally misinterpret situations. The less a person understands his own feelings, the more he will fall prey to them. The less a person understands the feelings, the responses, and the behavior of others, the more likely he will interact inappropriately with them, and therefore fail to secure his proper place within the larger community. Certainly, societies have differed in the extent to which they highlight these various views and end states of human growth, in their relative emphases on the individual as against the social self, in their espousals of explicit modes for training personal intelligences. I shall be examining some of these variations more closely when I consider personal knowledge across cultural boundaries. What needs to be stressed at this point is that one can discern the main features of both phases of development. The focus on others and the mastery of the social role, as well as the focus on self and the mastery of one's own personal life, in every normal individual. Emphases may differ, but the fact that one is a unique individual who still must grow up in a social context, an individual of feelings and striving, who must rely on others to furnish the tasks and to judge one's achievements, is an ineluctable aspect of the human condition, and one firmly rooted in our species membership. Comparative psychologists are sympathetic to the possibility that even the most treasured facets of human nature may be found, if in somewhat simpler forms, in other animals. In addition to claims for some linguistic ability in chimpanzees, we know that chimpanzees can also recognize that daub of rouge as being on their nose, as monkeys cannot. And there is a growing belief that at least primitive forms of consciousness, if not of self-awareness, may be found among higher mammals. Yet, all but the most ardent animal lovers would concede that the forms of personal knowledge under discussion here are still restricted to human beings. In any case, the question arises, which factors in the evolution of our species have spawned the remarkable focus on the person and on other persons that characterizes Homo sapiens? Of the numerous factors that have been cited as contributing to human uniqueness, two seem especially closely tied to the rise of personal knowledge, both the individual and the social varieties. The first factor is the prolonged childhood of the primate and, in particular, its close tie to its mother. We know that chimpanzees spend the first 5 years of their lives in close proximity to their mothers, and that vast amounts of learning take place during this period. The mother provides models that the young offspring can observe, imitate, and retain in memory for subsequent simulation. Equally important, the mother indicates by her behavior which sorts of things and events ought to be noted by the young animal, and thereby defines a universe of significant activities and individuals. The mother is the initial and remains the principal teacher. She can even instruct the youngster in carrying out novel patterns of behavior, for example, foraging for potatoes, which have only made a recent appearance in certain pockets of the species. So important is this significant other during the opening years of life that when she is injured or otherwise removed from the scene, the normal development of the individual is placed in jeopardy. The focus on a single other individual for so lengthy a time, the fact that one can learn so much from that individual and eventually pass on that acquired knowledge to the next generation, may well constitute a powerful source of the emphasis on the person found in the human species. A second factor in the evolutionary past of the species is the emergence several million years ago of a culture in which hunting assumed great importance. Whereas foraging, gathering, or the killing of small animals can be carried out alone or informally in the company of one or two others, the hunting, tracking, killing, sharing, and preparation of the meat of larger animals is an activity that inevitably involves the participation and cooperation of a large number of individuals. Groups of humans or of pre-humans, presumably males, must learn to work together, to plan, to communicate, and to cooperate, all in order to snare and share the meats of the hunt. Young males must be trained so that they can participate in the hunt. For instance, the boys must learn to track, to distinguish different smells and cries, to control their gestures and synchronize them with specific partners, to build up certain muscles, to aim accurately, to find their ways around strange locales, and to return to designated spots at the appointed hour. More generally, the existence of the human group becomes closely tied to the lives of the nearby animals on whom the humans become dependent for food, shelter, clothing, and even religious activity. In light of these requirements for effective hunting, the needs for group cohesion, leadership, organization, and solidarity become relatively easy to understand. Why there should be the emergence of a nuclear family, with the aforementioned strong tie between mother and child, and ties of a different sort between father and child, particularly the young male, is perhaps less evident. It is certainly conceivable that other social arrangements, distinct from a nuclear family with strong parent-offspring ties, could have evolved in societies where hunting was a pivotal activity. Perhaps in this extremely speculative area, it suffices to point out that the nuclear family provides one highly adaptive solution to a number of issues: the building of strong interpersonal bonds that bolster the solidarity of the wider community, the training of young males to be hunters, the training of females to be householders and future mothers, the guarantee of some stability as far as mating patterns are concerned, the prevention of possibly injurious incest, and the preservation and transmission of various forms of knowledge and wisdom. Evolutionary clues to the origins of intrapersonal facets of intelligence are more elusive, in part because these forms of knowledge are less readily identified and documented by scientific observers. One factor that may promote a recognition of oneself as a separate entity is the capacity to transcend the mere satisfaction of instinctual drives. Such an option becomes increasingly available to animals that are not perennially involved in the struggle for survival, have a relatively long life, and engage regularly in exploratory activities. Certainly, the use of any kind of symbol system and of language, the preeminent symbol system, also promotes this personal variety of intelligence. Intimations of personhood become more probable in those animals with proto-symbolic capacities. The evolutionary origin of the personal intelligences has engaged the speculative powers of some of our leading students of human prehistory. The paleontologist Harry Garrison makes a sharp distinction between the perception of other individuals and the perception of self. In this view, the perception of others in social roles can often be handled at the level of organization of fixed action patterns. In other words, as high-level reflexive actions built into the repertoire of the organism, and indeed the recognition of conspecifics, including particular relatives, occurs readily in many animal groups. In contrast, Garrison sees the perception of self as a peculiarly human development of the capacity for creating objects in the real world. Garrison goes on to maintain that knowledge of self may build on our imagery and imaginative powers, which allow us to create models of ourselves. The British psychologist N.K. Humphrey stresses the creative capacities involved in knowledge of the social world. In fact, he makes the bold claim that the chief creative use of human intellect lies not in the traditional areas of art and science, but rather in holding society together. He points out that social primates are required to be calculating beings, to take into account the consequences of their own behavior, to calculate the likely behavior of others, to calculate benefits and losses, all in a context where the relevant evidence is ephemeral, likely to change, even as a consequence of their own actions. Only an organism with highly developed cognitive skills can make do in such a context. The requisite abilities have been worked out over the millennia by human beings and passed on with great care and skill from the elder to the younger individuals. The outcome has been the gifting of members of the human species with remarkable powers of social foresight and understanding. This social intelligence, developed initially to cope with local problems of interpersonal relationships, has in time found expression in the institutional creations of the savage mind. The highly rational structures of kinship, totemism, myth, and religion, which characterize primitive societies. Elusive as the perceptual basis of the personal intelligences may be, the question whether animals experience and are able to discriminate among various feeling states is shrouded in even greater mystery. to my mind, impressive evidence that discrete feeling states may exist in neurally bounded forms comes from the work of John Flynn. This investigator has shown that it is possible to trigger in cats a complex form of affect-laden behavior by direct electrical stimulation of the brain. For instance, even in cats who do not under ordinary circumstances attack mice, one can produce full-blown attack behavior and associated facial expressions simply by stimulating certain brain regions. This means that the attack system has evolved to function as a unit. Neither experience nor training or learning is required for full and proper firing. We see here evidence that a whole set of behavior patterns, ones presumably accompanied or even triggered by specific affective states, can be set off by endogenous, internal, as well as by conventional environmental triggers. Studies inducing and then suppressing profound depression in rats by injecting chemicals into the brain provide another line of supporting evidence. Possibly such pre-packaged reactive programs are exploited in higher species in more varied, less canalized situations. In a species closer to human beings, one can see evidence for the origins of a particular emotion. Donald Hebb has demonstrated that a full-blown fear state can be evoked in the chimpanzee without any need for training or specific prior experience, simply by the presentation of a display significantly at variance from what the animal has previously perceived. In this case, a chimpanzee will become extremely frightened, excited, or anxious when it beholds an inert, mutilated, or dismembered body of another chimpanzee. The precipitating object must be sufficiently divergent from other members of a class to command attention, while still exhibiting enough of its properties to be perceived as a member of the same class. According to Hebb's formulation, the fear originates in the disruption of cerebral activities, usually involved in perception. It is distinctive from other emotions by virtue of its accompanying physiological reactions, as well as of the processes that tend to restore cerebral equilibrium. For example, flight from the threatening object. Thus, even as young human infants have emotional reactions tied to specific precipitating events, so too we find in a closely related species a set of event-related reactions that signal an incipient awareness of the category of individual to which one belongs. That the category is another person, and that the response is so severe, provides further suggestive evidence that the origins of personal intelligences can be discerned in species other than our own. It is important to stress that such organized reactive programs can also be undermined, given certain environmental manipulations. In the monkey, for example, there exists a complex set of effectual systems that surround the development of the attachment link between mother and infant. Under normal rearing conditions, these systems will evolve without a hitch. Yet, thanks to Harry Harlow's pioneering studies of motherless monkeys, we know that the absence of certain stimulating conditions will yield a monkey that is grossly abnormal in the personal domain. These monkeys are not able to react appropriately to other monkeys. They cannot assume their proper role in the dominance hierarchies. They cower in fear or aggressively attack in inappropriate situations. And, most tellingly, they prove unable to raise their own offspring, if they are even able to conceive at all. To a certain extent, the effects of motherless rearing are reversible. For example, if younger organisms are allowed to play with and otherwise substitute for the maternal figure. But even such substitution encounters a statute of limitations, beyond which time the monkey's knowledge of how to relate to conspecifics has been permanently devastated. It is worth underscoring that while maternal deprivation exerts irrevocable effects on the personal intelligences of the monkeys, it does not exert comparable effects upon other cognitive capacities, such as those measured in routine problem-solving tasks. Apparently, even among infrahumans, intellectual competences enjoy a certain autonomy from one another. Abnormal social reactions can also be caused by surgical interventions in monkeys. In the light of studies by Ronald Myers and his colleagues at the National Institutes of Health, we know that a number of sites in the primate nervous system play crucial roles in the kinds of adequate social behavior that are part and parcel of interpersonal intelligence. Specifically, removal of the prefrontal cortex in juvenile primates causes decreased use of face and voice for communication, alteration in aggressiveness and patterns of grooming, decreased participation in play activity, and frequent sessions of hyperactivity of an aimless variety. Significant social maturation must have occurred for the adverse effects of the prefrontal lobectomy to be felt. This finding suggests that the requisite modulating structures develop gradually during the period of social growth that Harlow and his colleagues have illuminated. Many of the effects wrought by damage to the prefrontal cortex are also mimicked by lesions in the anterior temporal areas of the cortex. Following lesions in this area, operated animals failed to rejoin their family groups and did not attempt to reestablish their preoperative dominant status. They also showed a decreased patterning of facial expressions, gestures, and vocalizations. Unlike the frontally injured monkeys, those with temporal lesions were prone to exhibit inappropriate aggressive behavior. In general, Myers concludes, the most readily apparent change in the behavior of the animals with the prefrontal or the anterior temporal lesions was a reduction in those activities that maintain social bonds. Myers has put forth the provocative suggestion that there may be two distinct neural mechanisms that serve, respectively, the actual inner feelings of the monkeys and their abilities to express or convey these emotions facially, whether they are actually felt. According to Myers, lesions at the base of the brain can produce a paralysis of the volitional use of the face while leaving intact spontaneous facial expression of an emotional nature. This finding suggests that we may be able to find in infrahuman organisms a preliminary and biologically based intimation of the difference between intrapersonal access to feelings, one's inner state, and the ability to express them voluntarily to others, interpersonal communication. Studies conducted by Ross Buck with human beings confirm the existence of distinct neurological systems in human beings for dealing with volitional as opposed to spontaneous expression of emotions. Apparently, like other primates, our ability to convey emotions deliberately to others proceeds along a separate track from our spontaneous and involuntary experiencing and expression of emotions. We see then that even in as patent a human domain as the knowledge of self and other individuals, it is possible to find antecedents among our primate brethren. Of the analogies between human interpersonal knowledge and that displayed by other primates, there seems to be little doubt. And while the development of knowledge of oneself seems more peculiarly human, research with chimpanzees provides a helpful perspective on the origins of this most human of capacities. Nonetheless, given the incomparably greater development in human beings of personal forms of knowledge, researchers have naturally been concerned about the fate of personal knowledge, both inner and social, under various conditions of damage to the human brain. Once again, all indices point to the frontal lobes as the structures of greatest importance in various forms of personal knowledge. Defects in the frontal lobe can interfere with the development of personal forms of knowledge and can cause various pathological forms of intrapersonal and interpersonal knowledge. It has been known for well over a century that destruction of the frontal lobes in an adult exerts only relatively minor effects on that individual's ability to solve problems, such as those featured on a standard intelligence test, but can wreak severe damage on his personality. In brief, the individual who has had major frontal lobe pathology, particularly if it is bilateral, emerges no longer recognizable as the same person by those who had known him before. There may well be more than one syndrome of personal change following injury to the frontal lobes. Frank Benson and Dietrich Blumer suggest that injury to the orbital, lower area of the frontal lobes is likely to produce hyperactivity, irritability, insouciance, and euphoria, while injury to the convexity, higher regions of the frontal lobe, is more likely to produce indifference, listlessness, slowness, and apathy, a kind of depressive, as opposed to psychopathic, personality. Indeed, among different individuals, one will find varying mixes of these symptoms, quite possibly correlating with the exact site of damage. But what must be stressed is that in individuals whose cognitive performance, whose other intelligences, seems relatively preserved in a computational sense, a sense of the same person is uniformly felt to be absent. No longer does the individual express his earlier sense of purpose, motivation, goals, and desire for contact with others. The individual's reaction to others has been profoundly altered, and his own sense of self seems to have been suspended. But since this symptom picture might result from significant damage to the brain, independent of the precise site of the lesion, it becomes important to determine whether, in the face of massive brain injury at other sites, the individual might still display a preserved personality, an enduring sense of self. Pertinent to this issue, the Russian neuropsychologist Alexander Luria reported several years ago the fascinating case of the man with the shattered world. As a young soldier in the Second World War, Zasetsky had suffered a severe battle wound in the left parietal occipital area of his head, an injury that drastically crippled him across a distressingly full range of conceptual and symbolic faculties. His speech was reduced to the most elementary forms of expression. He could not write a single word or even a single letter. He could not perceive in his right visual field. He could not hammer a nail, carry out simple chores, play a game, or find his way outside. He was confused about the order of the seasons, unable to add two numbers or even to describe a picture. Yet, according to Luria, Zasetsky maintained something far more precious than these standard intellectual capacities, those person-related functions associated with the frontal lobes. He continued to possess will, desire, sensitivity to experience, and the treasured ability to form and sustain plans and carry actions through as effectively as his condition permitted. Thus, over a 25-year period, Zasetsky worked steadily to improve his own performance. Under Luria's guidance, he was able to re-educate himself to read and write. He kept a notebook in which he painstakingly recorded his daily progress. He even proved able to introspect about his condition. Words have lost meaning for me or have a meaning that is incomplete and unformed. Every word I hear seems vaguely familiar. As far as my memory is concerned, I know a particular word exists, except that it has lost meaning. So I have to limit myself to words that feel familiar to me, that have some definite meaning for me. In contrast to the frontal lobe patients described by Benson and Bloomer, one feels that Zasetsky remained fundamentally the same person, who could continue to relate in normal fashion to other individuals. Why should the frontal lobes have this special status for the individual's sense of person, such that an individual with a spared frontal lobe can continue to have access to his own views of himself, while other individuals with less extensive damage may have totally lost this presence of mind? According to Wal Nauta, a leading neuroanatomist and longtime student of the frontal lobes, the frontal lobes constitute the meeting place par excellence for information from the two great functional realms of the brain: the posterior regions, which are involved in the processing of all sensory information, including perception of others, and the limbic systems, where individual motivational and emotional functions are housed, and whence one's internal states are generated. The frontal cortex turns out to be the realm where neural networks representing the individual's inner milieu, his personal feelings, motivations, and subjective knowledge, converge with the system representing the external milieu, the sights, sounds, tastes, and mores of the world as transmitted through diverse sensory modalities. Thus, by virtue of their strategic anatomical location and connections, the frontal lobes have the potential to serve as the major integrating station. And this they do. At the core of personal knowledge, as represented in the brain, and particularly in the frontal lobes, seems to be two kinds of information. One is our ability to know other people, to recognize their faces, their voices, and their persons, to react appropriately to them, to engage in activities with them. The other kind is our sensitivity to our own feelings, our own wants and fears, our own personal histories. As we have seen, intimations of these abilities can be found in the animal kingdom and certainly within the primate order. The recognition of faces and voices, the formation of close ties to other organisms, and the experience of a range of feelings are certainly not the exclusive property of human beings. Moreover, each of these forms can be compromised by experimental surgery. But the ability to link these forms of knowing to symbols so that we can conceptualize our intuitive knowledge of ourself and our more public knowledge of others emerges as a unique human function. It allows us to formulate theories and beliefs about other individuals and to develop a propositional account of our own person, which I have elsewhere dubbed a metaphor of the self. In all probability, many areas of the brain, subcortical as well as cortical, participate in the development and elaboration of these forms of personal intelligence. But because of their unique role as an integrating juncture, and because of their relatively late development in the history of the species and of the individual, The frontal lobes play a privileged and irreplaceable role in the forms of intelligence with which we are here concerned. The status of personal knowledge has also been studied in other pathological populations. Some pathologies may block the development of knowledge of self and others. With respect to young human beings, we find the occasional individual who is autistic, a child who may well have spared computational capacities, particularly in areas like music or mathematics, but whose pathological condition is in fact defined by an inability to communicate with others, and by so impaired a sense of self that the child has singular difficulties in deploying the words I and me. Whatever the problem that devastates the autistic child, it clearly involves difficulties in knowing others and in using this knowledge to know oneself. The aversion of eyes from other individuals serves as an especially poignant symptom of this disorder. To my knowledge, one does not find idiot savants of an opposite type, individuals with an excessively highly developed sense of self. Such knowledge and maturation of self appear to require so extensive an integration of other capacities that the individual would have to be an essentially normal person. Yet it may be worth remarking that in certain forms of retardation, such as Down syndrome, the ability to forge effective social relationships with others seems relatively well preserved, at least in comparison with more straightforward cognitive capacities like language or logic. Whether this form of interpersonal savvy translates to insights into one's own condition, to a kind of intrapersonal knowledge, seems highly doubtful. Moreover, in the case of certain disorders, such as that found in the psychopathic personality, the individual may be extremely keenly attuned to the intentions and motivations of others without displaying comparable sensitivity to his own feelings or motives. Finally, it is also possible that some individuals may have excessively precocious or keen knowledge of their own feelings without being able to indicate or act upon this knowledge in the presence of others. By definition, this condition would be most difficult for an observer to identify. One may examine the fate of personal knowledge in individuals who have sustained various focal injuries, for instance, in persons once normal, who have become aphasic as a result of damage to the dominant cerebral hemisphere. It might seem that language holds the key to self-knowledge, and that in the absence of this form of symbolization, the ability to conceive of oneself or to cooperate with other individuals would be seriously, if not fatally, compromised. In fact, however, severe aphasia can be sustained without equally devastating implications for personal knowledge. Among those who have been aphasic but have recovered sufficiently to describe their experiences, we find consistent testimony. While there may have been a diminution of general alertness and considerable depression about his condition, the individual in no way felt himself to be a different person. He recognized his own needs, wants, and desires, and tried as best he could to achieve them. Family members and physicians generally concur that given the severity of the impairment, the aphasic's ability to relate to other individuals and to reflect upon his own condition survives surprisingly well. As if to reinforce this point, an instructively different symptomatic picture is found among individuals who have sustained unilateral damage to the right, non-dominant, or minor hemisphere. In these patients, language is ostensibly intact, and so one might expect an unimpaired ability to make discriminations with respect to oneself and other persons. In fact, in sheer capacity to banter, such patients may superficially appear to have remained the same person. But it generally takes merely a few minutes of discussion to confirm that the ability to deal with others has been maintained chiefly, if not exclusively, at a verbal level, and that there exists a large, perhaps insurmountable gap between the former personality and the present modes of relating to others. Ties to others appear very superficial, and remarks do not seem to emerge from the same individual that had thrived prior to the onset of the brain insult. There are, moreover, little sense of drive, meager signs of plans for recovery, scant eagerness to form or to reaffirm personal relationships. The patient may announce that he is fine, reflecting the denial of illness often associated with the condition, and that he is going to return to work the next day. But he will in fact sit for hours near a doorway without moving. Perhaps indeed the lack of awareness of their actual condition is a major factor in the poor recovery typically found in patients with injury to the right hemisphere, even as the often surprisingly good recovery of skills in the aphasic patient reflects the preserved sense of self and initiative, along with a concomitant awareness of lingering deficits. Further perspectives on personal knowledge can be obtained from studies of other patient populations. In patients with Alzheimer's disease, a form of presenile dementia, the breakdown of computational capacities, particularly in the spatial, the logical, and the linguistic realms, is often severe. Yet at the same time, the patient will remain well-groomed, socially appropriate, and continually apologetic about errors that he makes. It is as if the patient felt his powers waning, was aware of this decline, and was distraught at the failure to circumvent his difficulties, but would not vent his frustration in a publicly hostile way. My interpretation of this strange and disquieting set of affairs is that the patient's frontal lobes remain relatively preserved during the early stages of this form of presenile dementia. Alzheimer's disease actually attacks the posterior brain zones with special ferocity. In contrast, patients with Pick's disease, another variety of presenile dementia which is much more frontally oriented, show a rapid loss of social appropriateness, a symptom picture more reminiscent of the irascible forms of frontal lobe pathology. So far, I have considered pathologies that in some way diminish personal knowledge. It is also possible to look at individuals whose personal knowledge has been altered rather than actually reduced by a neurological disorder. Patients who suffer from temporal lobe epilepsy prove particularly instructive in this regard. Such patients come to exhibit somewhat different personalities. Their own view of the world changes, often profoundly. Whatever their previous personal orientation, they tend to become introspective, given to writing extensive tracts, increasingly tending toward the study of philosophy and religion, and the relentless pondering of deep questions. There may be considerable rage which can erupt at any time, but in the same individual there is an intensification of ethical and religious feeling that may give rise to a desire to be excessively good, careful, and God-fearing. In addition, there may be a viscosity in these patients in that they seek to form excessively close ties to others and prove unable to let go in a personal encounter. It is risky to compare epilepsy directly with destruction of brain tissue because the condition entails an abnormal firing of nervous tissue rather than the massive destruction of neurons. Yet the fact that the individual's personality constellation and his way of relating to others may be significantly affected by this condition. Even as performances on measures of language and other standard cognitive measures may remain just as before, provides additional suggestive evidence that personal intelligences are a domain apart. Perhaps even two domains apart. Based on extensive work with temporal lobe epileptic patients, David Baer has recently put forth some intriguing notions about two forms of behavioral breakdown and their neuroanatomical substrates. One set of cortical regions, located in the dorsal parietal region of the cortex, seems critical for surveillance, attention, and arousal. Its injury results in indifference and in the loss of a sense of caring about one's own person. A contrasting set of cortical regions, located in the ventral temporal regions of the cortex, seems critical for the identification of stimuli, for new learning, and for appropriate emotional responding. Lesions in this latter area produce a lack of concern with external stimuli and, accordingly, inappropriate emission of sexual or aggressive responses toward other individuals, with scant consideration of the previously learned consequences of such flagrant displays. While Baer's scheme has not been developed specifically to deal with the varieties of personal intelligence introduced here, one can readily draw suggestive parallels between these forms of impairment and our pair of personal intelligences. Probably the most dramatic discovery in neuroscience of the past generation also proves relevant to my topic. As is known by virtually every scanner of the Sunday supplements, and by readers of Chapter 3 as well, it is now possible through surgical procedures to disconnect the two halves of the brain and to test each separately. In addition to providing further confirmatory evidence that the left hemisphere is dominant for linguistic functioning and the right for spatial functioning, research with split brain patients has provided suggestive evidence that an individual possesses, at least potentially, more than a single consciousness. Indeed, the individual may harbor two or even more consciousnesses or selves, which in the wake of the surgical intervention have become alienated from one another. Considerable effort is now being invested in characterizing these forms of consciousness, in seeking to discover whether they are both equally subjective or objective, and whether one has some kind of existential or epistemological priority over the other. It may well be that both are involved in emotional processing, with the left hemisphere somewhat more oriented toward euphoria, happiness, and optimism, the right hemisphere toward pessimism, reaction, and hostility. This is why destruction of either hemisphere tends to produce the opposite, spared configuration of traits. It may also be that the consciousness of the left hemisphere is simply more oriented toward words and other discrete symbols and analytic categories, while the right hemisphere is correlatively primed for the emotional, spatial, and interpersonal realms. Perhaps we can find intimations of these two cognitive styles in normal individuals, with individuals who exploit right hemisphere processes being somewhat more humanistically oriented, while those who favor left hemisphere processes being somewhat more sober, scientific, or straight. Even though these pictures are caricatured and the brain is far more than two little selves, one should not minimize the purchase on human intelligences that may eventually be obtained from studies of the sundered hemispheres. As I have elsewhere criticized those who would too readily dub each hemisphere with a single epithet, I want to underscore the dangers of basing excessive claims about personal intelligence on such a smattering of cues from different patient populations. In candor, the amount of knowledge available about personal intelligences is less, and certainly less compelling, than that available for other more conventionally computational forms of intelligence, ones less susceptible to cultural canalization. The evidence from different brain-damaged populations can be read in a number of ways, and it is by no means certain whether a contrast between left and right hemisphere lesions, between cortical and subcortical damage, between dorsal and ventral injuries will come closest to cutting the personal intelligences at their proper joints. Still, our discussion clearly suggests that forms of personal intelligence can be destroyed or spared in relative isolation from other varieties of cognition. There are highly suggestive hints in both the evolutionary and the pathological literature that intrapersonal and interpersonal intelligences can be discriminated from one another. More decisive findings must await the devising of more sensitive measures and the advent of more satisfying descriptions of each form of personal intelligence. Personal intelligences may be rooted in biology, but vast and highly instructive differences in their constitutions can be discerned across cultures. Anthropological explorations have been of fundamental importance in laying out some of the alternatives and showing how a different balance can be struck between intrapersonal and interpersonal knowledge in various selves. To convey an initial flavor of the variety, I can do no better than to review Clifford Geertz's sketch of three contrasting concepts of the person, which he encountered in a quarter-century of fieldwork. In Java, where he worked in the 1950s, Geertz found as lively and persistent a concern with the concept of self as one might encounter among a collection of European intellectuals. As part of a general concern with philosophical issues, even the least prosperous Javanese displays interest in what constitutes a person. In the Javanese view, a person harbors two kinds of contrast. The first obtains between inside and outside. In a manner familiar to Westerners, Javanese isolate the inside, felt realm of human experience, the flow of subjective feeling that is perceived directly. They contrast this phenomenological immediacy with the outside world, the external actions, movements, postures, and speech that in our culture would warm the analytic hearts of strict behaviorists. Rather than being functions of one another, these inside and outside facets are regarded as realms that need to be ordered independently. The second kind of contrast obtains between pure or civilized on the one hand, and rough, uncivilized, or vulgar on the other. The Javanese strive to achieve the pure or civilized form both in the inner realm, through religious discipline, and in the outer realm, through proper etiquette. The ultimate result is a divided conception of the self, half ungestured feeling and half unfelt gesture. An inner world of quiet emotion and an outer world of shaped behavior confront one another as two distinct realms, which the Javanese must somehow negotiate successfully within a single body and a single life. Certainly, the tension between the two faces of personal knowledge is directly confronted in the Javanese context. What has a philosophical tinge in Java is handled in theatrical terms in Bali. In this enduring Hindu culture, one observes a perpetual attempt to stylize all aspects of personal existence, to the point where anything idiosyncratic is muted in favor of the assumption of one's assigned place in the drama of Balinese life. Individuals are conceived of in terms of the masks they wear, the roles that they play in this continuing pageant. People are identified through their roles in a perpetual cast of characters, with current accidental factors subjugated in order to highlight a permanent set of status relations. The big risk and fear in such a presentation of self is that one's public performance will come apart, and one's own personality, as we would call it, will assert itself. As Geertz describes it, when this occurs, as it sometimes does, the immediacy of the moment is felt with excruciating intensity, and men become suddenly and unwillingly creatural. All efforts are maintained vigilantly to protect the stylized self against the threat of immediacy, spontaneity, and brutishness. In this culture, a clear decision has been made to accentuate the interpersonal and to mute the intrapersonal forms of self. The Moroccans whom Geertz came to know in the mid-1960s lived in Sefru, a small city about 20 miles south of Fez. The town consists of an astounding variety of individuals from different backgrounds: Arabs, Berbers, and Jews, and different professions, tailors, horsemen, and soldiers, reflecting wide differences in wealth, modernity, and migrant status. A swell of humanity reminiscent of a medieval pageant. Perhaps to counter the dangers of anonymity in this variegated assemblage, the Moroccans have adopted a practice, a symbolic means for identifying one another, called the nisba. One's nisba is one's attribution, a short label attached to one's name that indicates the region or the group from which one comes. By this mode of identification, Umar of the Bugadu tribe, Muhammad from the Sus region, one becomes known to other individuals. The precise labeling used at any one time may depend upon the context. The smaller the group in which one is presently located, the more precise the labeling. But the practice of identifying an individual in this manner is universal among the denizens of Sefru. A nisba must be seen as part of a total life picture. One of the most pivotal characteristics of Moroccan society is a strict distinction between the public and the private person. The lively and fluid mosaic of Kasbah life is carefully segregated from the guarded privacy of the individual's personal concerns. Rather than dividing its diverse society into castes, the Moroccans distinguish the contexts where men are strictly separated from one another, marriage, worship, law, and education, from those more public contexts, work, friendship, trade, where they are variously connected to other individuals. People interact with one another in terms of public categories whose meanings refer to geographical sites, and leave the more personally experienced forms of life to be savored in the privacy of their tents and their temples. Thus, the Nisba system creates a framework in which persons can be identified in terms of supposedly immanent characteristics, speech, blood, faith, and yet be allowed considerable latitude in their practical relations in public places. What turns out to be permitted is a kind of hyper-individualism in public relations, where almost everything specific can be filled in by the processes of interaction. At the same time, one does not risk the loss of self, which has been carefully set off in the more intimate and insulated activities of procreation and prayer. In the Moroccan setting, then, there is room for cultivation of both intrapersonal and interpersonal intelligences, but the two are never melded into a single integrated self. Though Geertz's careful and caring descriptions were devoted to another end, an explication of how an anthropologist may understand other peoples through an examination of their symbolic forms. These portraits provide a validation of the distinctions that I have introduced in this chapter. We see here three disparate cultures, spanning half the world and many centuries of historical evolution, each coping with the same set of constraints. How to confront the feelings, the exigencies, and the idiosyncrasies of each individual, on the one hand, and still allow smooth and productive functioning with other members of the community, on the other. Each of the cultures deals with this tension in characteristically distinctive ways. The Javanese by explicitly positing two distinct realms of existence that each individual must somehow keep in balance. The Balinese by veering sharply toward the public pole and trying desperately to prevent the raw aspects of personality from coming out. Except perhaps in the relatively ritualized setting of the cockfight. and the Moroccans by relegating certain portions of one's life exclusively to private expression, thus allowing considerable freedom for the remaining interactions in the public arena. By these diverse routes, each of these cultures ultimately engenders a person, a sense of self, an idiosyncratic but adaptive amalgam of those aspects of experience that are most purely personal and internal, and of those that govern and maintain one's relation to the outside community. Just how the self will be expressed, just how the balance will be struck, depends on a host of factors, including the history and the values of the culture, and quite possibly the nature of the ecology and the economy. It is scarcely possible to anticipate the particular forms that conceptions of persons and selves will take in disparate corners of the world. What one can predict, however, is that every culture must somehow come to grips with this ensemble of concerns, and that some nexus between interpersonal and intrapersonal issues will always have to be forged. It follows that the sense of self developed within a given cultural matrix will reflect the synthesis wrought therein between intrapersonal and interpersonal facets of existence. As one surveys the cultures of the world, one encounters fascinating variations in both interpersonal and intrapersonal forms of intelligence. One also finds varying amounts of emphasis on the personal forms of intelligence per se. While, for example, in the Western context, logical, mathematical, and linguistic intelligences receive heavy stress, forms of personal intelligence are correlatively emphasized in traditional societies, and even today, in developed societies outside of the West, such as Japan. Short of a Cook's tour of the world's cultures, there is no way fully to portray the range of solutions that have been devised with respect to forms of personal intelligence and to senses of self. It is possible, however, to classify and characterize the various solutions along a number of different dimensions. Borrowing a distinction from my colleague Harry Lasker, I can begin this survey by distinguishing between two ideal types of society. In a particle society like our own, the locus of the self inheres primarily in the specific individual. The individual is seen as having considerable autonomy and as essentially in control of his own fate, which may range from unalloyed triumph to disastrous defeat. There is an associated interest, even a fascination, with the isolated individual person, even as the external environment is seen as providing mere background support or interference. The Western notion of the solitary hero, struggling against the hostile environment and against inimical others, symbolizes a particle existence. It is vividly realized in the French literary tradition. The great national literary project construes the self as the locus of all possibilities, avid, unafraid of contradiction. Nothing need be lost, everything may be gained, and the exercise of consciousness as a life's highest aim, because only through becoming fully conscious may one be free. Poaching an analogy from physics, we may contrast the particle with the field society. In the latter, the locus of attention, power, and control is placed in the hands of other people or even of the society as a whole. Far from accentuating the individual person with his own goals, wants, and fears, the focus in a field society falls almost entirely on the environment in which one finds oneself. This surrounding context is seen as the determining force in an individual's life, the locus where decisions are actually made. Even in cases where an individual comes to stand out, he is seen as being selected or as moved into a niche without having a particular say or even any wish to have a say concerning his own peculiar fate. For Jean-Paul Sartre, an apostle of the French literary tradition, hell is other people. For individuals in a field society, oneself is other people. And when one's fellows have been shorn away, there is hardly an irreducible core of self left. Nearly all traditional societies, and even modern non-Western societies, place a much greater weight on field factors and are far less likely to attribute significant decisiveness or free will to the individual particle. Among the Maori of New Zealand, for example, a man's identity is determined by his inherited status and his relationship with his group. Outside of his group, a Maori is no one. Neither suffering nor pleasure come from the inside. Instead, they are seen as the result of external forces. Analogously, among the Dinka of southern Sudan, there is no conception of a mind that stores up one's own experience. Instead, the person is always the object acted upon, for example, by a place. Rather than being an object of study, the world is an active subject whose impact is felt by the passive individual. How different this perspective is from that customarily assumed in a Western particle society. The emphasis on the self as a single atomized particle is a peculiar legacy of Western political, philosophical, and literary traditions, dating back perhaps to Greek times and apparently unrivaled elsewhere in the world. We must be careful not to confuse our sense of the person with those entertained by other cultures. And we must recognize that even in Western societies, there are vast individual differences in field independence and in judged loci of control. In their concern with the realm of the person, the cultures of the world can be arrayed along other instructive dimensions as well. A first consideration is the extent to which these cultures have elaborated an explicit theory of the person. Some societies, such as the Maori of New Zealand, make distinctions only in the language of everyday life. Other groups, such as the Yogas of India, posit a theory of the development of self that is far more complex and differentiated than any embraced in the West. The way in which the realm of the person is carved serves as another useful point of comparison. In traditional China, the mind and physical objects were not set apart. In contrast, among the Ojibwa of the Lake Superior area, the realm of the person is extended to a far wider range of entities, including animals, rocks, and one's own grandmother. Cultures also differ in an instructive manner in those aspects of the person that they choose to value. Among the Japanese, a style of minimum message communication is cultivated. Spurning the maximum message of spoken language, the Japanese depend upon subtle nonverbal cues to provide the key to one's true feelings, motivation, and message. The Japanese also cherish and dignify jiken, real and direct feelings, and revere the person attuned to his own jiken. Proceeding along a rather different path, the Navajos place a special premium on the ability to be a good listener. Keen listening is seen as the key to proper decision-making. Those who can listen well are considered to have special gifts. While cultures differ appreciably in their relative emphasis on the intrapersonal or interpersonal intelligences, one encounters social roles that require a maximum development of both. A particularly stunning example in this regard comes from the Ixtals in Guatemala, who consult a shaman or daykeeper for advice and counsel. As described by Benjamin N. and Laura M. Colby, the role of the daykeeper entails an extensive development of both forms of personal knowledge. He must assess his patients' situations, their behavior, their concerns. He must also himself lead an exemplary life, or at least try to. Doing all this requires self-analysis as well as an empathic viewpoint for understanding others. It requires an updating, a revising, and a repairing of one's self-image. It requires a conceptualization of others which is added to and revised. A conceptualization that includes attributes and relations which one's clients and their families and friends maintain with each other. It requires an understanding of the goals and values that motivate people, and of the way in which the context or situation can modify these goals and intentions. A full consideration of the various roles cherished in diverse societies would doubtless clarify the emphasis placed upon differentiated forms of interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence. Even as the therapist, the religious leader, or the artist in our culture exploits various forms of personal understanding, it is likely that shamans, sorcerers, magicians, fortune tellers, and others of this ilk have a highly differentiated knowledge of the personal realm. In Western society, we have our Rousseau and our Proust, who have cultivated knowledge of self, even as we have artists like Shakespeare, Balzac, and Keats, whose knowledge of other persons, whose negative capability has been exemplary, and whose ability to place themselves into the skin of others is inspiring. There is every reason to believe that a similar range of skills and roles will be found elsewhere. In any event, it seems parsimonious to assume that in cultures where social connections are even more important than in our own, the ability to understand other persons and ferret out their motives is certainly at a premium. In considering those forms of knowledge that revolve about other persons, we have entered a realm where the role of the culture and of historical forces proves especially salient and pervasive. It makes sense to think of some forms of intelligence, for example those involved in spatial processing, as operating in essentially similar form across diverse cultures and as relatively resistant to cultural molding. But it is patent that when it comes to personal knowledge, the culture assumes a determining role. Indeed, it is through the learning and use of the symbol system of one's culture that personal intelligences come to assume their characteristic form. We here encounter factors that have a long evolution. As a species, we have reached a unique degree of individualization, one that has culminated in the possibility of a sense of personal identity. As sociologist Thomas Luckman has pointed out, the emergence of a sense of personal identity is possible only because of the detachment of our species from the situational here and now, and also from complete absorption in the immediacy of experiences. Owing to this enhanced sense of perspective, we become able to experience our environment through a rich and reasonably stable structure of objects and events. We can go on to integrate sequences of situations into a history of typical events. We can attend to other individuals and recognize the reflection of ourselves in their behavior and actions. Ultimately, the emerging sense of personal identity mediates between the phylogenetic determinants of human existence and that particular pattern of history that has been made by earlier generations of humans. Because each culture has its own history, its sense of self and of others will necessarily be unique. In the light of these special circumstances, it is appropriate to question whether personal intelligences, knowledge of self and others, should be conceived of as being at the same level of specificity and generality as the other intelligences that we have considered in earlier chapters. Perhaps it makes more sense to think of knowledge of self and others as being a higher level, a more integrated form of intelligence, one more at the behest of the culture and of historical factors, one more truly emergent, one that ultimately comes to control and to regulate more primary orders of intelligence. I doubt that the question of the specialness of personal intelligences permits a sharp and decisive response. In some ways, the personal intelligences are as basic and biological as any intelligences considered here. Their origins can be discerned in the directly experienced feelings of the individual, in the case of the intrapersonal form, and in the direct perception of significant other individuals, in the case of the interpersonal variety. In these senses, the personal intelligences conform to our working notions of a basic intelligence. Yet it is undoubtedly true that the diverse forms that personal intelligences can eventually assume are among their most outstanding features. And, particularly in the West, it seems reasonable to deem the individual's sense of self as a kind of second-level regulator, an overall metaphor for the rest of the person, and one that can, as part of its duties, come to understand and to modulate an individual's other capacities. In this sense, then, the personal intelligences may not be directly commensurate with those intelligences that I have treated in earlier chapters. But it is equally important to stress that this glorification of the self is a cultural option, one that has been taken up in contemporary Western circles, but that is in no sense a human imperative. Cultures confront the choice of selecting as a primary unit of analysis the individual self, the nuclear family, or a much larger entity, the community or the nation. Through this choice, cultures determine, nay, dictate, the extent to which the individual peers inward to himself or gazes outward to others. One reason why we in the West tend to focus, even perseverate, on the individual self is because this aspect of existence has, for historical reasons, achieved increasing prominence within our own society. Were we living in a culture in which the focus fell chiefly on other individuals, on interpersonal relations, on the group, or even on the supernatural, we might well not be impaled on the dilemma of the self as special. For, as we have already seen, any consideration of the specialness of the self cannot be undertaken apart from an analysis of the values and interpretive scheme of a particular society. Nonetheless, if compelled to present a transcultural statement about the self, I would offer these remarks. I see the sense of self as an emerging capacity. From one vantage point, it is the natural result of the evolution of intrapersonal knowledge. But this evolution necessarily takes place within an interpreting cultural context, even as it is necessarily channeled by representational capacities that draw on the full gamut of human intelligences. In other words, in my view, every society offers at least a tacit sense of a person or a self, rooted in the individual's own personal knowledge and feelings. However, this sense will inevitably be interpreted and possibly be remade by the individual's relationship to and knowledge of other persons and, more generally, by the interpretive schemes supplied by the encompassing culture. Every culture will also engender a mature sense of the person, which will involve some balance between intrapersonal and interpersonal factors. In certain cultures, such as our own, the emphasis on the individual self may become sufficiently extreme that it leads to the appearance of a second-order capacity, which presides over and mediates among the other forms and lines of intelligence. This, then, is a possible outcome of cultural evolution, but an outcome, it must be stressed, that is difficult for us to judge and may be based, at least in part, on an illusory view of the primacy of our own powers and the degree of our own autonomy. Having now reviewed at considerable length our family of 7 intelligences, we might perhaps conceptualize them in broad strokes in the following way. The object-related forms of intelligence, spatial, logical, mathematical, bodily, kinesthetic, are subject to one kind of control, that actually exerted by the structure and the functions of the particular objects with which individuals come into contact. Were our physical universe structured differently, these intelligences would presumably assume different forms. Our object-free forms of intelligence, language and music, are not fashioned or channeled by the physical world, but instead reflect the structures of particular languages and musics. They may also reflect features of the auditory and oral systems, though, as we have seen, language and music may each develop, at least to some extent, in the absence of these sensory modalities. Finally, the personal forms of intelligence reflect a set of powerful and competing constraints. The existence of one's own person, the existence of other persons, the culture's presentations and interpretations of selves. There will be universal features of any sense of person or self, but also considerable cultural nuances, reflecting a host of historical and individuating factors. In reflecting upon the place of personal knowledge in this set of intelligences, I broach the issue of the status of the theory as a scientific enterprise. There are questions to deal with about the particular intelligences as well as about the viability of the enterprise as a whole. While the final critique must be left to others, it seems appropriate at this point for me to articulate some of the most salient difficulties with the theory, as well as my own thoughts on how these might best be handled. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find Gardner's book summary and many other fundamental persuasion books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more psychologic and marketing content. See you in the next one.